Okay, welcome back, everyone. Tonight we're going to talk about Portugal in the frame of wines of the world. We just talked about Spain, so it's only natural to move over to Portugal, and we'll talk about the Madeira Islands as part of this. The Azore Islands also get an honorable mention for winemaking, but it's not covered in the scope of our presentation tonight. Unfortunately, too many amazing areas to talk about in one evening. So our outline for tonight is to talk about the fun facts of Portugal, the wine regions, the wine classifications and laws, and then any fun varieties and information along the way as well, right? So Portugal is just another country with a colorful history and tradition and winemaking history as well. So some fun facts to get us started. Portugal is actually one of the oldest wine regions, and it's actually, when people talk about it, they say it's where time has stopped for wine. They have very old and prevailing wines that are still made and enjoyed today. So, like Port and Madeira have been made for centuries and they're still enjoyed. It also ranks 10th in wine producing countries worldwide, despite its size. There are around 600 species of birds in Portugal. It is a very common stopping point for migration from Africa to Europe. So very diverse species of birds. So if you are a birder or you know people who are, they might want to travel to Portugal, right? Also, interestingly enough, Portugal contains the oldest surviving bookstore in the world. It was established in 1732 in Lisbon, and it is still going strong today. Portugal also produces 70% of the world's cork exports. So that includes Germany, the United Kingdom, and the US. We are their top importers for cork for our wine products. So very cool. And you can see some cork trees here. So it's, if you don't know about cork, it's the bark that's harvested off of a tree and then it becomes processed. The bark does grow back on these trees, so they're very environmentally friendly. It does not harm the tree, it just grows it back. You could think of it as like trimming your nails, basically, right? You can cut them back, they'll grow back. It does no harm to the plant whatsoever. So lots of very old cork tree farms and exports. Okay, so here we have a regional map of Portugal, and we have some of the top regions we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about the Douro Valley, Douro, Vinho Verde, Alentejo, and then the Madeira Island, of course, too. So we have the Douro Valley here in this red section. Vinho Verde is the very northwestern point. Douro is kind of north-ish central. Alentejo is more southeastern-ish area, and then Madeira, of course, is an island farther away. So lots of fantastic areas for winemaking, lots of wine traditions. Portugal is also a fun fact. Portugal is actually topped as the country that drinks the most wine per capita per person. So it's just so much part of that culture. I had family members that traveled to Portugal, and they said that it's very common in restaurants there. They just sit you down, they put a glass of wine in front of you and some bread, and then they ask what you want to have for dinner. So it's just assumed that everyone drinks wine and everyone enjoys it just as much as you would get like just a glass of water, right? Okay, so anyways, let's start off with the Douro Valley, right? Douro can be split into 3 subregions, and this is the same river that flows through Spain, right? So it starts in Portugal and then it goes into Spain. So for the Douro Valley in Portugal, there's 3 subregions for winemaking. There's Baixo Corgo, Cima Corgo, and then Douro Superior. The Baixo and Cima is like lower Corgo and upper Corgo in the relation to this river that flows into the Douro River. So the Corgo up here, you can see it flows right into the Douro River. And so we have these 3 winemaking regions, right? So Baixo, as it is closer to the Atlantic Ocean, is its coolest and rainiest subregion, very fertile region for grapevines. Cima Corgo is considered the heart of the Douro region. So this is where many of the higher end port wines are born. And then Douro Superior, this is the largest of the regions. It's also the hottest and driest. So it gets warmer and drier as you go up into the region. So they describe their summers as extremely dry and hellish. But this is also where a lot of the native vines are planted. So a lot of variety, dozens of varieties mixed together, and some very old vines. So So lots to be discovered in all those fun places. So Douro Valley is actually a DOC. We're going to talk about the certifications of Portugal. It's a lot simpler than a lot of other regions we talked about, but Douro Valley is a DOC. It's also a highly mountainous region. So the vineyards located along the Douro River are on very steep slopes. So it could be anywhere from a 35 to a 70 degree incline. So very difficult to work with. Could be very dangerous. That would mean that a lot of the work is done by hand. They probably don't use a lot of machinery or equipment. So very old methods of viticulture, and they're probably done exactly the same way today as they were back when they were established, right? The Douro, of course, is famous for their ports, right? So ports come from Portugal. It's a protected name, just like sherry or champagne or cognac, right? So it depends on where it comes from. We can't call our dessert wines ports in the United States because of that, right? So ports are a fortified wine. They're traditionally made when you take a red grape and it's fermenting, then you stop it partway through fermentation by fortifying it with an alcohol, right? So that is how we see it, and that is how it's traditionally made. But not all ports are reds. There are white and rosé ports, and they're made in a variety of sweetness levels. So dry, semi-sweet, and sweet. And we'll learn more about the different types of ports for aging in just a moment. The most common varieties that you'll see in the Douro Valley is Touriga Nacional, Tinta Barraca, Tinta Cao, Roriz, which is their term for Tempranillo. It's another clone of Tempranillo. Sazao, Malvasia Fina, and Rabigato. So Rabigato. Those are the varieties that you most commonly see on labels from the Douro Valley, right? And with that being said, there's different types of ports. So even though, like I mentioned, you could find ports as a white, a rosé, or a red, different sweetness levels, most of the time when you talk to someone who's like a collector of ports, they'll bring up ruby versus tawny. That is mostly a reference to the aging requirements for ports. So a ruby port would be a more fruit-forward, younger port. These are typically more red in color, and these are aged generally for 3 years, right? On the other end, we have tawny port. These are much more brown in color, typically come with nutty and caramel flavors, and these are aged between 10 to 40. That's just kind of like a general baseline. There are absolutely tawny ports that have been aged for much longer than that, of course, as well. So you can get a lot of different characteristics depending on what you like. And these are fantastic wines for like a nightcap. They're typically really intensely flavored and just delicious sipping wines. So generally speaking, a lot of folks who are new to wine gravitate to ports, and they will keep collecting them over the years, right? So that's always a fun one. Okay, so now we'll highlight one of the varieties that you would find in the Douro region, Touriga Nacional. You can actually find this locally. There are some wineries that are growing this and making wines from it. It makes delicious, port-style wines, but it also makes a really fantastic dry red as well. That's one of Portugal's most famous grape varieties. So commonly used in ports, of course, but the grape itself produces wines that have very intense color and tannins. Lots of texture and body in the wines that are produced from this grape variety, and the flavors that come from it are typically like blue fruits and dark fruits like blueberry, plum, violet, mint, and then wet slate. So very deliciously rich red wine comes from this. Yeah, high tannin, full body. Generally speaking, it can be made dry or sweet. Medium to high acidity, and it's generally made in a very bold style. So generally it's over 15% alcohol, regardless if it's dry or sweet. So very fun. I love a good Touriga Nacional. If you find a bottle, it's definitely worth trying. Okay, so now we'll move over from Douro south. We're going to go to Douro. So we're in this red region here. So this is actually one of the oldest established wine regions in Portugal. It takes its name very similar to Douro. It's the Douro River. So it's named after the region or the river that it kind of encompasses. It is, again, another mountainous region. The climate along the river is temperate, so it stays very mild and consistent between all the vineyard sites. A lot of the wines that come from this region are blends, both reds and white varieties, right? So Douro is another DOC of Portugal, and sometimes you'll find wines from this region that are imported that are called Douro Nobre. This would be a title of a top reserve wine, which translates to a noble Douro. So it's a very noble wine. These tend to be very bold and tannic due to extended maceration techniques. So their style of winemaking lends to more extraction. They're leaving it on the skins for a longer time to create a really highly concentrated product, right? And then top varieties for Douro specifically include Touriga Nacional, again, Tinta Roriz, which is the Tempranillo, and then we have a couple other ones that are much lesser known, but then we also have a grape variety known as Bastardo, which you won't find in many places, which is very interesting. So Bastardo is actually genetically linked, well, it is, it's a synonym for Trousseau, right? The variety itself originated from northeastern France, where it is still called Trousseau. It's mainly found in France, Spain, and Portugal. The wines from this grape variety have a deep cherry red color and flavors of dark red berries and forest fruits. These wines can have very high alcohol, right? It's becoming exceedingly harder to find this grape variety from Portugal because a lot of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay plantings are taking over regions just in general. So we're kind of finding this, and we're seeing a lot of criticism from kind of wine and grape variety lovers that we have these grape varieties that a lot of people are referring to as like colonizer varieties, like Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, all these noble varieties that everyone loves. But as we reduce the plantings of these native varieties that are hard to find and planted in only, so many acres in a specialized region, these varieties could become extinct over time, right? Unless we find a way to preserve them somehow. So it's becoming more difficult to find, but something to look out for if you are out and about shopping for wine. Okay, next, we're going to go all the way north to the west to the lovely region of Vinho Verde. Typically for folks who are, wine lovers, they will stumble onto a Vinho Verde occasionally, right? It is a really refreshing, white, slightly fizzy wine. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Vinho Verde is the name of the wine and the region. So Vinho Verde is a DOC. It's actually the largest DOC in Portugal, and it is this part of Portugal, and actually most of Portugal, is actually very lush and green. But here we have a very cool and rainy northwestern province of Minho, and the region as a whole is an elevated granite plateau. There's lots of rivers that run through it, including the Minho River, and this geographical natural river is actually the border for what is Rias Baixas in Spain, right? So we think about the really nice, fresh, acidic white varieties in Rias Baixas that we just learned about. Very similar here in Vinho Verde. You could argue they're cut from the same cloth, but very similar geology and climate here. Cool. And then Vinho Verde just translates to green wine. That has nothing to do with its color. It's a reference to a couple different things. It's a reference to the early drinkability of the wine, the lush landscape of the region. The region itself just looks very green and beautiful. And then also the flavors that are related to Vinho Verde too. So lime zest, gooseberry, all these green kind of notes are also a reference to the green wine, but it's definitely not the color. Okay, so Vinho Verde. So if you have a Vinho Verde from the region, it's typically a white wine blend, which is really interesting. They're also normally slightly bubbly, and that's on purpose, and that's from the malolactic fermentation happening in the bottle. The wines are so crisp and light, they taste green, right? And this is even a descriptor given to the reds and rosés. 70% of the vineyards that are planted in Vinho Verde are white grape varieties, right? So for the varieties, we have Alvarinho, Arinto, Loureiro, Azul, Trajadura, and Avesso. So interesting varieties, right? This Alvarinho might look really familiar, and that's because that is basically the same as Albarino in Spain, right? So slightly different spelling, same grape variety, basically. And then for reds, we also have a combination of grape varieties as well, right? Cool. And the wonderful thing about Vinho Verde is I feel like it's the ultimate summer wine. It pairs with like salads, sushis, fish tacos, picnics. You can mix it with lemonade if you want, right? It's just a really easy, fun, refreshing white wine. And you can't go wrong. Okay, so a little bit about Vinho Verde. Now we're going to go southeast to Alentejo. We talk about Alentejo. It's much, much different than Vinho Verde, right? We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But it's also large. It extends across approximately 1/3 of the country, and there are lots of terroirs within just Alentejo. So we're going to try our best to keep it broad and to summarize what it's all about, right? The region as a whole is certified for Vinho Regional, but there are 8 subregions with DOP status. This region is actively leading the revolution against Portugal's value for money reputation. So for a long time, and even still now, we see a lot of wines imported from Portugal. You can get an amazing bottle of wine for $15. And it's amazingly complex, great flavor, great balance. So that has been like the stereotype. But Alentejo is trying to really raise the reputation so they can start charging more for these wines and just to gain more respect worldwide, which is really cool. This is also the region that's famous for their cork production. So Quercus suber is what's grown here. It's a very large region. It's very warm. So there's lots of cork forests where they harvest and then export that around the world. And it's typically a family business that's been operated for multiple generations. Typically they have like these kind of machete based tools where it's like this long knife that has to fit the length of your forearm for how it cuts against the tree, and it's made specially for you. And anyways, it's a really cool traditional export and like business of Portugal, but specifically to this region as well. There's also a lot of Roman ruins in Portugal, which is like one of the fun sightseeing things to do, and there's a lot in Alentejo specifically. Okay, so as far as the wines in the region is generally warm. It's much farther inland from the Atlantic Oceans. There are some areas at the foothills of mountains and the northeastern areas that are said to be like a cooler mesoclimate, and that's because, weather is moderated by a couple things, or climate is moderated by different things. So it could be moderated by a large body of water. Water keeps things relatively cool or warm because once it absorbs all that energy, it acts as an insulator for everything around it. However, on the other side of that, mountains are also a really good moderator of climate because cool air will actually flow off the backs of mountains at night. And then during the day, as the air warms up, it will rise up to the top of the mountain. So you have this like temperature swing every day of the climate warming and the climate cooling. So there's a dual side to that. It's a duality, right? Overall, for the wines from Alentejo, they're said to be generally rich, easy drinking red wines, right? For traditional reds, we have Aragones, which is a clone of Tempranillo, Castelao, and Trincadeira, right? And they also are known for leading this new winemaking revolution where they're also adopting grape varieties that are not native to Portugal, So they are actually making a lot of plantings of Syrah and Cabernet Sauvignon, right? And they do produce a common white variety, and that's Antau Vaz, which is really interesting. So Alentejo does produce a lot of really good wines. There are some very expensive, high quality wines from this region, right? Because they're trying to push that stereotype of, the value for money away. They're trying to become more prestigious. But overall, really fun area, right? Okay, so now we're going to kind of focus in on Castelao, just because it was a fun variety that we probably have never heard about, so I was looking into it. So Castelao is a red grape variety with high acid and tannin. It's described as rich and concentrated with rustic and wild fruit character. It's made as a rosé and a fortified wine, so not just a red, a dry red. Recommended pairings for this, because of the rustic character, was mushroom risotto, pork and bean soup, or grilled light meats like grilled chicken thighs was recommended. And the flavors that are reported by Wine Folly are red currant, plum, strawberries, dried meat, and mocha. So very interesting. Generally, it's medium dry, medium bodied, medium high tannins, medium high acidity, and can be found anywhere between 13.5% to 15% alcohol. So something fun, something different. Okay, now we're moving much farther away from Portugal, and we're going to the Madeira Islands, all the way out here, just west of Africa as well. So this is an island. It's off the coast of Africa, technically speaking. It's 300 miles off of the Moroccan coast, but it is a province of Portugal nonetheless. So Madeira is famous for Madeira wine, which is oxidized, fortified, and Madeirized wine. That's how it's made. So Madeirizing is exposing the wine to heat and oxidizing it to produce caramel and other flavors. So there's actually a history to this. We're going to talk about this in the next slide. Is how did this come to be, right? It's pretty bizarre. Madeira is a tank when it comes to wine. It's already been chemically transformed in like basically any way possible, right? So it can age for as long as 200 years, right? Even after the bottle's opened, it will continue to age just fine because you're already drinking it in the state that it was intended. So it's in this interesting, like, chemical state, basically. Generally, they're about 17 to 20% alcohol by volume, and they do come in a range of sweetness levels. They do come dry, semi-sweet, and sweet. A lot of people know Madeira for cooking. Some people do just drink it as well. If you'd like to learn more about the quality levels and varieties specifically for Madeira, I do have a link to Wine Folly here as well. So the story behind Madeira is really interesting, actually. So the wine dates back from the age of exploration, so around the end of the 15th century. It was a standard in shipments heading to the New World or the West Indies. The wine was purposefully fortified to prevent it from spoiling on the ship, but wine was exposed to a lot of heat and movement in the travels, so it actually transformed the flavor of the wine. And the wine producers didn't know what was happening until an unsold shipment came back to them. So they didn't realize that the wine was being cooked and that it was not how they intended it to be, upon arrival. But it was still selling. So this is just how it ended up being. So because of its composition, Madeira can last for decades, even after being opened, right? Okay, so a little about Madeira. It's a fortified wine coming from the Portuguese Madeira Islands. Made in all styles, right? Dry, sweet, or an aperitif. Some versions are actually created with salt and pepper in them, so they're actually designed for cooking. Today, wines are still made with applied heat and extensive aging, and they'll last for centuries, right? Some of the characteristics associated with Madeira are burnt caramel, walnut oil, peach, hazelnut, and orange peel. So very interesting characteristics. Generally speaking, when you buy Madeira, it is sweet. It is very full body, low to no tannin, medium high acidity, and generally it's over 15% alcohol. So very, very intense. Like, you think about the sherry that we had in our Spanish class for wines of Spain. They're not the same by any means in their winemaking, but I think as far as the flavor profile and the intensity of this wine, you could put it in a similar space as sherry, but made in completely different ways. The only thing they do share is the oxidation. So that is something they do share. Okay, on to Portugal, wine classifications. So in Portugal, the highest quality is considered a DOC. This is also written as DOP. So DOC, DOP, this is synonymous in this case, right? There are 31 DOCs of Portugal total. These have defined geographical boundaries. They have restrictions on the varieties in the yields from the vineyard. So overall, not too complicated considering other regions that we've learned about so far, right? One step below that on the ladder is the Vinho Regional, which is an IGP. There are 14 of these in Portugal. These are large geographical areas, and they have less restrictions on varieties in the yields from the vineyards. And then we just have Vinho, which is just table wine. So overall, very simple, straightforward quality tiers in the Portuguese wine industry. So here we have just written out verbally for you guys. So DOC, also written as DOP. This is a strictly defined geographical area. Only permitted grapes. Harvest yields are absolutely controlled. IPR, which is also used for Vinho Regional or regional wine. It has regional representation, but there are more freedoms on varieties used and harvest yields. Many great and creative wines are labeled as IPR, right? And then we just have Vinho, which is table wine. Okay, we do have some wine terms that are specific to Portugal, which is really interesting. So if you go shopping for wines specifically from Portugal, you might see some of these things on the label. So Vinho Tinto just means red wine. Vinho Branco means white wine. Then there's Quinta, which means wine farm, or basically like winery, right? Then we have Reserva. This does have meaning on Portuguese wine labels. This is wine that must come from a single vintage, and it has to pass a tasting panel specifically. Then we have Reserva DOC, which has the regular Reserva requirements, but it also has to have a higher alcohol content. And then last but not least, we have Garrafaria, which is you have to meet the Reserva parameters and be aged for 2 years in a cask and 1 year in the bottle. So it's kind of similar to the like Rioja, Spain aging requirements, but there is some nuances to that. So if you see any of these words on a Portuguese wine label, hopefully you can understand what they are. Awesome. And then we have our learning objectives, just as usual. So I hope you guys enjoyed this presentation. I always encourage you, if this sparked your interest, go out there, do more research, learn more things. I'm always an advocate for that. I hope this was straightforward and made sense. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. But otherwise, I look forward to seeing you guys next time.